Okay, just before we move on to section B, which is the history of the Second Age and what we can expect from the Amazon TV series, I've got 3 true or false questions for our lore master, Mr. James Wilson. And the first one is Galadriel older than the moon?
I'm going to say yes, she is, because there's kind of the sun and the moon actually get invented. Again, this is me going into the lore. The sun and the moon are invented quite late after the creation of Middle Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So
Correct.
it's essentially, yeah, I won't go into too much detail, but if you want to know like the origins of the sun and the moon and everything about that, read the Silmarillion. It's my best recommend. If you really want to understand the lore of Middle Earth, and especially like the history of the First Age, the Silmarillion is an absolutely fantastic read. So yeah, it's kind of like, for most Tolkien purists would say, yes, the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit are really good, but if you really, really want to get deep into the history of Middle Earth, read the Silmarillion. So yeah, little plug for that book.
Mm-hmm. Question 2. The Witch King is the one who asks Farmer Maggot for directions.
I would possibly say that's not true, because we don't actually know the name of the Ringwraith who asked Farmer Maggot for directions. So it literally could have been it's kind of like we do know the Witch King and a few Ringwraiths do enter the Shire, but we don't actually have a name. We don't actually know who did what. Although, interestingly, in Tolkien's writings, apparently there is a scene where they come across the Buckleberry Ferry, and they look up on the other side and they actually see a Ringwraith slithering around. And apparently, in later writings, Tolkien named this Ringwraith as Camul the Easterling. So it's quite possible that it was Camul who asked Farmer Maggot for directions.
Yeah, according to Lord of the Rings wiki, whether that's the fountain of accurate knowledge or not, it is supposed to be Carmul who asks where they can find Baggins. Supposedly, he is also the one in the movie with the line Shire Baggins. Question 3. The titular 2 towers are not the same in the book as they are in the film.
That is true. In the 2 towers, the towers they refer to are, you've got the Tower of Orthanc, basically Isengard, and you've got Minas Ithil, Tower of the Moon, which you also know in the films as Minas Morgul. So I think essentially for time constraints, I can only assume they added the whole, like the stairs of Cirith Ungol, Shelob's Lair, into the Return of the King. It's probably, I would assume it's been done for timing reasons, so they could essentially focus more on the Battle of Helm's Deep, because that's the main battle of the 2 Towers books. I can understand why they want to spend a lot of time on that, but the 2 towers in the film are Orthanc and Barad-dûr. So it's kind of like it's an alliance between the two. It's like an unofficial alliance between the two of them. Even Gandalf says it. There's a union between the 2 towers, Orthanc and Barad-dûr. So they kind of they didn't change the plot exactly. They just changed which story it appears in. I can kind of see why they've done it for timing, because like the whole Shelob's Lair and the Stairs of Cirith Ungol, it does take place around about the same time as the events at the start of Return of the King. So they kind of it fits together quite well. But I have always maintained it would be a fantastic ending if they had included the Shelob's Lair scenes in the 2 towers. I mean, yes, it would have probably stretched the film into 3.5 hour territory, but can you imagine, like, you get to the whole end scene, we think Frodo's dead, and they carry him off, and then there's that whole, they realise he's not actually dead, he's just been stunned by Shelob's venom, and he just goes, "Samwise, you fool," screen cuts to black, to be continued. That would just be quite a good way of ending the trilogy, especially if you hadn't read the books before seeing the films and you saw that. That would be it was a fantastic cliffhanger when I read it in the books. So it would be interesting to see him do that in the films. But I can completely understand that second film of the trilogy, great big battle scene. It makes more sense to focus on that rather than a little bit of building up a little bit of suspense for the next film. So.
Well, in the history side of it, Tolkien was sort of rushed for a title for the second one, and he in later years expressed regret that he didn't like the title at all, and he changed his mind on which towers were part of it. At one point, he even mentioned Cirith Ungol because that's where Frodo and Sam end up at the end of that book. Yeah, but for the movie, they opted to keep it simple and go with the two main towers for the two main baddies.
That obviously then makes me. I wonder then that kind of triggers like alternative titles for the second book. So it's kind of no, I don't know if that does that list does that have any alternative titles he suggested, or is it just he just didn't like the Two Towers name?
Just didn't like it.
All right, there you are, listeners. If you want to suggest, what do you think the title of the second book could have been? Put a comment below, and we'll see.
So section B is going to be about the Amazon TV series. So as far as we know, they have only got rights to the Second Age. And for a lot of casual fans, maybe ones who've just seen the movies, or maybe even just read the books, they might not be overly familiar with the events and characters of the Second Age. So I thought we'd just get you to give us a download of all of the information we need.
Well, this is where it's going to get interesting because there's actually not a lot that's been written by Tolkien about the Second Age of Middle-earth. So there are two main things that I think the Amazon series, technically you could say it's three, but there are two main things that the Amazon series is most likely to focus on, because you've kind of got the two real significant events of the Second Age of Middle-earth are the Last Alliance, which take place right at the end of the Second Age and ends with the defeat and overthrowing of Sauron, and that's kind of, it does get covered in small detail at the start of the Age. So I think the easiest thing to do is we'll focus on the Last Alliance for now, because there is like a story they could tell. I mean, the War of the Last Alliance drags on for many years. I mean, the Siege of Barad-dûr itself, which ends with the Dark Tower being overthrown and ends with the defeat of Sauron, the death of Elendil and Gil-galad. It's actually, the Siege of Barad-dûr takes 10 years. So that's 10 years just besieging the Dark Tower and eventually bringing it down, as Sauron then commits himself to the field of battle, where he's eventually cast down and the One Ring gets cut from his finger. So there's potentially some, if you wanted to do like the War of the Last Alliance, from driving the forces of darkness back into Mordor, you've got the Battle of the Dagorland Plain, which essentially means Dagorland basically means battlefield. Literally, Dagor is the Elvish word for battle. So that's so you've kind of got that where they fight their way, they drive the forces of Mordor back. So that potentially can get covered in the TV series, and we might be introduced to Isildur. We might get a young version of Isildur. We might get introduced to Anarion as well, who is Isildur's brother, and he's kind of like, he's the founder of the line of stewards. But it's kind of, they say Anarion founded the line of stewards, but he founds the line of the kings of Gondor as well. It's essentially the heirs of Isildur all dwell up in the north, whereas it's the heirs of Anarion who dwell in the south. And it's kind of only because the line of Anarion, it doesn't exactly die out, so to speak, but it's essentially because obviously as the line of Gondor expands, and obviously the bloodline gets diluted slightly. So the stewards are still, technically they are part of that house, but they're not direct descendants of Anarion, because that line's died out, has essentially died out. So it's kind of the direct bloodline itself has actually, no, died out might be the wrong term to use, because essentially it's not died out as such, but like the direct heirs don't exist anymore. So it's kind of like they turn to like his distant relatives. So it's kind of like, oh no, the king's dead, we can't find an heir to replace him, but he's got a third or fourth cousin twice removed. He can take over the role because he's technically related to him. So that's kind of, it's kind of where the line of the stewards picks up from. They rule alongside the kings of Gondor, and essentially that line takes over. So that's just a little bit of background on the line of an area. And sort of events that take place before the Last Alliance, obviously one of the most significant events of the Second Age is the forging of the Rings of Power. And so you kind of got with the elves of Eregion, and it is entirely possible we'll be introduced to the character of Celebrimbor. And for those of you who don't know who that is, Celebrimbor is an elven smith of great craft and skill. And if you're an absolute Tolkien purist, you'll know that Celebrimbor is the grandson of Fëanor, who is the elf who forges the Silmarils, which are then stolen by Morgoth, and that triggers off the whole war of the First Age that ultimately leads to the intervention of the Valar. It leads to the destruction of Middle-earth, and leads us very nicely on to what I think the Amazon TV series is going to cover, and that is the downfall of Númenor. To give Númenor a little bit of background, at the end of the First Age, Middle-earth has been completely ruined by the War of Wrath, which is the last war that was fought between elves, men, and the Valar to essentially recover the Silmarils from Morgoth. So quite a lot of Middle-earth has been badly damaged, and essentially what's left of the men of the First Age are essentially the ones who remained loyal and fought with the elves. And in that lot, you've got Elrond's brother, Elros. And so what happens is the Valar basically say, okay, we're going to create this land for you to live in. It's an island that they create, and they basically say, you can live on this island, enjoy it, have fun with it. The only thing we ask is that you don't travel to Valinor, which is like the Blessed Realm, way beyond the edge of the world. It's been created exclusively for the elves. So as it goes on, the elves start to depart west for Valinor, and they do still visit with the men of Númenor. So as the years go by, Númenor kind of it prospers. They turn into this great seafaring nation, and essentially they gain great strength and power, and like they do embrace the elves. But as time goes on, they start to get more and more jealous of the elves. It's kind of like, yes, we live really long. We live a really long time. We live for like 200-300 years, some of us, but why do they have immortality? Why can they go to this like fair place where they can live forever? And so it's kind of a little bit of resentment starts to creep in. And then as we get towards like the later years of Númenor is when Sauron turns up. Kind of like he's like the chief servant of Morgoth in the Silmarils. And after Morgoth is defeated, and Sauron disappears for a while, and then basically appears in Middle-earth and starts causing trouble, because he befriends the elves and starts to learn all about the craft of ring making. So with Celebrimbor, he forges the 7 dwarf rings and the 9 rings for mortal men, but he doesn't touch the 3 elven rings, as it's told in Lord of the Rings. He doesn't touch those rings. He knows of them, but he never touches them. And then obviously he forges the 1 ring, and quite naturally that the elves are not happy with that, and that triggers off the war of the elves and Sauron over not necessarily over the rings, but essentially it triggers a whole war between Sauron and the elves. They realise just how dangerous the 1 ring is, and like the power that it can grant Sauron. So
the blurb for Fellowship, the introduction, says this ring will control all others. How does it exert the influence over the rings of men is a bit more well known, but how does it influence the dwarven and elvish rings?
Technically, because Sauron didn't have anything to do with the forging of the elven rings, it doesn't actually affect them. But I think it's because Sauron had a hand in forging the dwarven rings, which is why if he's crafted them, it would probably be why they are susceptible to the power of the One Ring. It's kind of, it's not something that I think is widely covered in the whole lore. It doesn't really explain the power. The power of the One Ring isn't overly delved into. It's kind of it's introduced as a little trinket that can make you invisible, but we don't know like the power it gave Sauron when he put it on. I mean, the actual story of Sauron in the Second Age, he does forge the One Ring. He goes to war with the elves, and kind of it's looking bleak for the elves, and then the Númenóreans arrive and actually help the elves by technically defeating Sauron. But Sauron, being clever, he hides the One Ring and says to Númenor, "Oh, you've caught me." And he essentially says like, "Oh yeah, you've caught me. Take me back as your prisoner." And so he then gets taken back to Númenor, and that's where the real trouble starts, because he poisons the minds of the Númenóreans, turns them against the elves, and basically says, "You've got a huge fleet of ships, you've got a huge army, you could actually sail over to Valinor and you could actually take it by force, you can make it yours." And so this triggers what I think will probably form the main part of the Amazon series, or at least potentially this could be series 1. This could cover. We don't actually. I think I don't think they've got rights to just cover the Second Age of Middle Earth. I think they've chosen to do the events of the Second Age for the first. It could just be for the first series. It could be that they do it over several series. But essentially, the idea is with the downfall of Númenor, in their absolute wrath and anger that the Númenóreans have breached have actually broken their sacred command. The Númenor, the island itself, is consumed by the sea. So, like the Valar, these are the supreme beings that help create the world of Middle Earth. They change the shape of the world, because it was originally the world is flat, and then now it becomes curved, so they can't reach it. And whilst the shape of the Earth changes, like a great chasm opens up in the Earth, the island of Númenor essentially gets tilted and is swallowed by the sea. I don't know if it's inspired by like the stories of like the lost city of Atlantis, which is, you can see an awful lot of parallels with like this huge island kingdom being swallowed by the sea. So it's kind of there's an awful lot of parallels being drawn to it, and obviously Tolkien was a massive fan of like the old stories like that. He's quite heavily influenced by. There's a lot of influence of stories like that in his work, and so like so to a certain extent Norse mythology as well, and kind of, but yeah, like the old myths and legends. There's a lot of that. You can see a lot of that reflected in Tolkien's work. So there's kind of, and then as a result of the fall of Númenor, you've kind of got like the loyal Númenóreans, which are like it's Elendil and his sons, Isildur and Anarion. So they escape the fall of Númenor and sail to Middle Earth, where they become Elfrend. And so you then trigger a few more significant events with the foundings of the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor. So what would be really, really interesting is if they then show us that whole scene where the Oathbreakers swear allegiance to Isildur, because we know it's not told in the books, but we know that has to have happened in the Second Age, because it's like Isildur arrives with this great big rock, the Stone of Erech, and basically plants it in the hills, and the hillmen there swear loyalty to him, and it's kind of like, then obviously they go off and they refuse it. So we could get potentially an episode that's devoted to how the Oathbreakers became cursed by Isildur. So you could potentially see things like the origins of the Army of the Dead. So whilst there's not a lot of backstory to the Second Age of Middle Earth, there are certainly, I think you've got the downfall of Númenor, which is probably the most significant event of the Second Age. You've also got Celebrimbor and Sauron and the forging of the One Ring, and then you've also potentially got they might build into the Last Alliance. But there's definitely a lot of potential for the Amazon series. So I think as well, because you've got a lot of unexplored areas of lore, and they've got a lot of dedicated writers behind it as well. So it's going to be interesting to see. I'm sure there's going to be people who are going to try and make it as accurate to the story as they can. But I think because there's not a lot told about the entirety of the Second Age, you've got a lot of open options for them to explore. So I'm really excited to see where they go with this, because it's stuff that you do read about it in the books, but just to kind of see how that's going to be told in the series is really exciting. So I'm really looking forward to that.
So they've been told you can have the Second Age, but you cannot contradict anything that Tolkien has expressly written as having happened during that time period. But otherwise, they've got quite a free hand in terms of characters they can invent, maybe events that happen. There've been rumours that it's going to be styled on Game of Thrones in sort of a political intrigue kind of story. Not sure that's entirely what I'm after, but
it would make, especially if they cover like the Kingdom of Numenor, that would make sense, because around about the time of the downfall of Numenor, you've kind of got quite a lot of the Numenorians have been swayed by Sauron, but you've kind of got this like a loyalist faction that still adheres to the old ways, and kind of like as it goes on, the Numenorians who have turned against the elves are they're trying to root out these people. So you kind of, in a political sense, you do have that, but then of course you've got like the formation of the Last Alliance. You've got the elves and you've got the dwarves as well, and kind of it'd be interesting to see. They might cover dwarves, because obviously dwarves do take part in the Last Alliance, and you've got the High Elves of the Noldor, but you've also got the Elves of Mirkwood. You've got Oropher, who is Thranduil's father. He joins the Last Alliance, and basically he says, "No, Gil-galad, I'm not going to listen to you. You're a Noldorian elf. I'm a Sindarin elf. I'm going to do what I want." And he goes off and gets killed, which is kind of like a maybe you should have listened kind of thing. But there's definitely a lot of scope. But I think for Numenor itself, I can definitely see them playing the political game, because it's like the last king of Numenor kind of, he gets himself to power by marrying his niece. I think his niece was meant to be the heir of Numenor, and she was meant to be the next monarch, and then he marries her and claims the kingship. So there's a lot of there are some political games being played, but I don't know if it's going to be Game of Thrones in that respect. But I'm imagining it's not going to be as X-rated as Game of Thrones, though.
No, you would think not. We've got Sean Weimer is asking us what familiar characters can we expect. So basically, who's alive at that time in history from the Lord of the Rings stories? And one from me. What are the wizards doing at this point? Because they're supposed to be very old, but you would have thought they would have been involved in the Battle of the Last Alliance.
You would have thought, yes. To answer Sean's question first, I think the likeliest characters you're going to see appearing in the Second Age from Lord of the Rings are, I think Elrond is the obvious one, because he's alive. He's alive. He's growing up through the. What you might actually see, you kind of get to see a character arc for Elrond, because obviously Second Age he's quite young, and his brother's gone off and he's basically said, "I'm going to embrace my mortal side," whereas Elrond has embraced the immortal side of being half elven. So you've got Elrond, who is growing up under like not quite the tutelage of Gil-galad, but he grows up with Gil-galad. So you've kind of got, obviously during the Second Age, we might well get a segment on the founding of Rivendell. So that would be an interesting thing. But I think if you want an actual, in terms of characters who appear throughout the entire trilogy, we'll definitely get Elrond. But you'll also, especially if they're covering Second Age, we're possibly going to see Isildur make an appearance. Like I said before, Isildur, Elendil could make an appearance. Gil-galad could potentially make an appearance. We could get Círdan, the shipwright, the master of the Grey Havens, because the Grey Havens are founded in the Second Age of Middle Earth. But yeah, in terms of actual Lord of the Rings characters, and this kind of leads on to your question about the wizards, is the honest question is we don't actually know. It's entirely possible. I don't think the wizards actually arrive in Middle Earth until the Third Age. I could be wrong on this point, so yeah, don't hold this with me, but I think it could be towards like the start of the Third Age the wizards arrive in Middle Earth. I don't know if they arrive in the Second Age, but yeah, essentially they do arrive, and they do a lot of wandering around. Well, Gandalf does a lot of wandering around Middle Earth, but kind of I think Saruman essentially settles at Isengard, and Radagast ends up in Mirkwood. But you kind of got the two blue wizards. It's literally they arrive, they wander off into the east, and that's that. They're literally we know absolutely nothing about them. So there's potential for them. We could be introduced. We could be introduced to them, but we don't. We literally know nothing about them whatsoever. They are a complete mystery. I mean, I don't. This is the kind of thing. It's weird to say there are 5 wizards and then you only focus on 3 of them, because this is kind of the thing. The whole history of Middle Earth, as we know, is unfinished, because sadly, well, 45 years ago this month actually, Tolkien passed away, and it was after his death that his son Christopher essentially gathered all the extensive notes that his father had written about Middle Earth and its whole history and backstory, and he did edit it. He edited it quite a bit to kind of make it into a coherent story, but then eventually published it. But quite a lot of the majority of the unpublished work of Tolkien has dealt with the first age of Middle Earth, so kind of like the whole creation of Middle Earth, and then the whole business with the Silmarils, and then focuses on sort of certain characters. So, like for example, Beren and Luthien, the fall of Gondolin, and so it's kind of those are the areas that the Tolkien's notes focus on the most extensively. Whereas sort of like the Second Age, and like there's a lot of unfinished history. I mean, it's kind of with things like the TV series, and even with the strategy battle game itself, it does leave an awful lot of interpretation, which I think can only be a good thing. But the one thing I will always say is when you're doing adaptations, you've got to make sure you honour the original in that respect. That's something you need to do.
Should Thranduil's halls be Green Alliance with Rivendell and Númenor then?
I would say no. And only unless they create a profile for Oropher, which is Thranduil's father. Because yes, so the Elves of Mirkwood would have fought at the time of the Last Alliance, but I think you wouldn't have Thranduil, characters like Thranduil, Legolas, Tauriel at that point. You'd have only had Oropher. He's the like I said, he's Thranduil's father, so he's the only one that you could logically add. So it'd be kind of like you'd have to, like you've got say for example, Balin's expedition to Moria. It's kind of like, so if you take Balin, you can't take it with anything else. It's kind of like a certain, you need a certain hero to make it Green Alliances. It's kind of like if you were to say, if you take Oropher, you automatically become impossible allies with every other army list, unless say you ally with So essentially Oropher, a Mirkwood army led by Oropher is only green allies with Rivendell or Númenor. So it's kind of like it's all about it's kind of like if you take a Shire list with Balrog 2, you can't take any named heroes, and it's impossible allies with everyone else. So it's designed to represent you taking an army from that specific period of time. So it would be interesting if they did an Oropher profile, but I think anything Second Age is is unlikely until we get a Last Alliance source book, which I'm sure we will get at some point. But it could be they do Rohan at War and then decide to do the Last Alliance, but we'll see. But yeah, until we get a Last Alliance source book, I think for now Thranduil's, because again it's meant to represent that specific time in history of Middle-earth. So Thranduil's Halls is from the Hobbit era, and obviously several thousand years have passed between the events of the Last Alliance and Thranduil's Halls. So that's kind of why.
Yeah, I thought Legolas probably won't be born yet, but I think Tom Maynard was saying to me about Thranduil was actually alive at the time, and he actually was involved in some of the fighting.
Yeah, that is entirely possible, but I think he's kind of he's fighting with Orifer is the kingdom at that time, so they can they might include they could potentially include a young Thranduil. Like one of the profiles they could do for Last Alliance is again, this one's a potential one. It's Elrond, Lieutenant, Herald of Gil-galad. So it could be like an Elrond who doesn't have the ring Velia, but you could say that he's got a banner effect because he's the Herald. Because it's kind of like this is going into the lore. The first elf to have Velia, the Ring of Air, was Gil-galad, and I think he gave it to Elrond before the War of the Last Alliance. I'm assuming he gave it to Elrond for safekeeping, but then obviously Gil-galad is killed in the War of the Last Alliance, and then Elrond assumedly takes up the ring of Velia. It'd be interesting if they included Círdan in the Last Alliance as well, because obviously he is around at that time, and it'd be interesting to see. It would be very interesting to see an armored Círdan. It's unlikely, but it would be interesting.
He doesn't need any buffs. Okay, just a quick quiz round again, just before we move on to the final section, which is listeners' Q&A. But for James, I'm just going to read the quotes from the movies, and he's going to tell me what's technically wrong with the Tolkien continuity. So, first one, Legolas, what do your elf eyes see? The Uruks turn northeast. They're taking the hobbits to Isengard.
Yeah, this is kind of I know the irregularity of this because actually in the book, what Legolas sees is Éomer and his riders. He doesn't actually see the Urukai at all. It's what it is. It's meant to demonstrate that the elves are incredibly far-sighted. So it's kind of like they can see. Kind of like they're this is going to sound strange. They're far-sighted and they're foresighted, in the sense that far-sighted they can see things a long way off, and foresighted in they can also see things a long way off, in that they can see certain events that are going to happen before they've happened. But yeah, the inaccuracy in there is they basically, whilst Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are running through Rohan, they get on top of the hill. Aragorn asks Legolas what he can see, and he says he can see all like Éomer's company. So that's the inaccuracy there.
Right. Well, that's an additional point that I wasn't expecting. The inaccuracy I had underlined was northeast, because if they were heading that way, they'd be going up to Lake Town.
Yes, they were heading in the wrong. Oh no, I thought you meant actually what he sees in the book. Oh no. In that case, yeah, turning northeast would be going the wrong way. Although, if you actually think about it, they're going from Amon Hen. So technically, if you assume a straight line from Amon Hen, turning northeast across Rohan would be going towards Isengard. But I can see
you'd go west across Rohan, wouldn't you, from Amon Hen?
Yeah, it's kind of again. This is where we're trying to get into the maps of Middle Earth. So kind of, but yeah, going northeast, they'd be heading towards ultimately Lothlorien and then Merkel and Laketown. So yeah, it could be. They do the orcs do cut along the eaves of Fangorn, so it could be they went that way and went along the edge of the forest to get to Isengard.
Second one, Gandalf reading aloud says the year 3434 of the Second Age. Here follows the account of Isildur, the High King of Gondor, and the finding of the Ring of Power.
Yes, this is kind of where, because the year 3434 of the Second Age is the start of the Siege of Barad-dûr. So it's not till about 10 years later that Sauron is defeated and Isildur gets his hands on the One Ring. So Again, there's a kind of, I think there is a little question about this one as to whether or not it is a historical accuracy, because it could be that the account starts in 34, ends with the recovery of the ring, and it could be they add the title at a later date. It's kind of like, to give you an example of that, when Bilbo's writing the Red Book, he gives it about 5 different titles before he decides on one he likes. So it could just be that Gandalf was reading the entire account, but obviously for the sake of the film, they only gave us that portion, which I think is that's probably a very long-winded and trying to get around the law way of looking at it. I think the likelihood is they just picked a date out of the air, and that's the one they chose.
So, a linked question: when does the Second Age technically end? Is it the death of Sauron, or is it the death of Isildur?
It's technically marked with the defeat of Sauron. It's kind of like the second and third ages of Middle Earth both end with the defeat of Sauron, because it's the official date of death given for Isildur is in the second year of the third age. So I would assume that with the destruction of Sauron, that is considered the end of the second age. It's kind of, again, where one age ends and another age begins. Kind of, it is a little tricky, because it's kind of like the first age is considered to end with the defeat of Morgoth and the recovery of the Silmarils, and so that triggers off the start of the second age with the founding of Numenor and that whole section, and then the second age ends with the War of the Last Alliance and the defeat of Sauron. So it's kind of technically the second age should end around about 34, 40 something, and then it just kicks off. It kicks off into the third age, and it's usually said that the end of it's kind of like the end of the second age is the fall of Sauron, and the death of Isildur marks the start of the third age, kind of like the death of Isildur and the disappearance of the One Ring. So it's kind of that's kind of there's a little bit of ambiguity about it, because we don't actually know when the last year of the second age is and the first year of the third ages. So this is where you get a little bit of, like I said, a little bit of ambiguity in the writing.
Fair enough. Number 3, Smaug says it's Oakenshield, that filthy dwarvish usurper. He sent you in here for the Arkenstone, didn't he?
Yes, this one is quite straightforward. No, the dwarves aren't after the Arkenstone. Initially, in the book, they're just trying to recover the stolen treasure. To which, at one point, Bilbo goes down, has a chat with Smaug, basically comes back up, and it simply says, "What, you expect me to bring all of it back with me?" And literally said, "I'd need 1,000." He says something like, "I would need 1,000 years and 50 of me to recover the entire hoard, even if there was no dragon." So, and it's kind of like it's a weird one. They kind of the basic plot of The Hobbit, and the plot of The Hobbit is very, very different in the films to it is in the books. So essentially, in the Hobbit book, they're essentially trying to recover the treasure that's essentially been stolen by Smaug. Whereas in the books, they're kind of like they're trying to retrieve the Arkenstone so that they can unite the dwarf armies and lead them to defeat Smaug and reclaim the Lonely Mountain, which is kind of a long-winded. But they write the Arkenstone as a jewel that essentially it grants kingship. So like if you've got the Arkenstone, it shows you that you've got a right to rule the dwarf kingdom. So I kind of understand that it's a symbol of power and authority. So the idea was to unite, like I think Gandalf kind of says, unite the dwarven armies, take back Erebor from Smaug. And so kind of they do change it a bit, quite dramatically actually. In the initial books, it's just 13 dwarves trying to recover the treasure, and they luck into Smaug getting killed. Spoiler alert, and recovering the treasure more through luck and skill. But yeah. There's quite a good interview. I think it's Martin Freeman and Stephen Colbert. Actually, it might not be Stephen Colbert. It's essentially Martin Freeman says Smaug gets killed, to which the interviewer goes, "Spoiler alert," to which Martin Freeman replies, "Yes, but the book is 78 years old." And so there's a lot of inaccuracies between The Hobbit and The Hobbit films and The Hobbit book. But again, we could you could literally spend an entire podcast writing about talking about the inaccuracies between the Hobbit book and the Hobbit films. But they are still very, very good films. They're very, very enjoyable to watch. But if you're, we've seen a few, I've seen comments on videos and Facebook threads, which is kind of like the absolute purist says this didn't happen, that didn't happen. But again, we can do an entire episode where the films differ from the books. I actually think that'd be quite an enjoyable one. So we could put that down as a potential subject for a later podcast. Like, leave a comment like what changed from the books did you enjoy, or what changed from the books did you not enjoy. So we can debate that at some length.
Well, actually, going back to the question that brought us here, you actually provided a lot of really interesting information about the Arkenstone and the plot device that was. That's actually not what I was underlining as the inaccuracy in that quote. My point was going to be that Smaug calls him Oakenshield, which is a name that he only picks up after Smaug has taken up residence in Erebor. It's because he goes to the fight. Is it the Mazabul fight?
As an Ulbazar, the Battle of Emerald Isle. Yeah, that's where he gets the Monkey Oakenshield. So I can understand that Smaug wouldn't have picked that up.
On to part C then, we are going to have a look at the listeners' Q&A. So thank you to everybody for writing into us. So we had a few questions which were given to me not by members of the EAHC, but the people have spun off that in the comments. So we'll go through a few quick ones. First one is, in the extended fellowship, Bilbo gives the date by Shire reckoning. So why do they have their own calendar?
So the Shire is well, everyone knows what the Shire is. It's founded in the middle of the Third Age, and essentially there's no real details given, but essentially the Shire forms its own calendar. So it's kind of like the old. I think it's because the Hobbits consider them. It might be because they consider themselves separate from the affairs of the big people. You kind of see it in conversations that hobbits have. They keep to themselves. They kind of keep their own affairs to themselves, and they don't really get involved with the dealings of the big people, as they like to refer to us. So essentially, all the records of the Shire are going to go back to the very first year that the Shire was founded, and it could be for that reason. I mean, Tolkien does write that the hobbits are very meticulous when it comes to making a note of this thing. It's like a hobbit will has to be signed by it's like 7 different people. It's like 7 different signatures in red ink. So it could be that because they're recording all like certain events, they started from the founding of the Shire up until now. But I think if you want to work out like the difference between Shire years and the actual year in Middle Earth, you need to subtract 1600 from the actual calendar year. So I think so the Third Age ends in about 3019. So if you subtract 1600 from that, it's 1419 in the Shire calendar. So I think that's the reason the Shire has its separate character, and it's probably because of meticulous Hobbit record keeping.
So do they go into the Fourth Age, or do they just sort of ignore that?
It's entirely possible that the Shire would go into the Fourth Age, but I think they would continue using the Shire calendar.
Okay, and related to the Shire, Bilbo states there hasn't been a dragon in the Shire for 1,000 years. So what happened then?
That, unfortunately, is not covered by Tolkien's writing. To be perfectly honest, I think that is a line just thrown into the film out of a joke. Just a little bit of light-hearted humour. I mean, there are dragons that exist in the First and Second Age, but interestingly, going back 1,000 years, so you're about 400 years into the creation. I might be making this up at this point, but I don't know if there's any truth to the rumours of a dragon being seen in the Shire, because I think if there was a dragon in the Shires, then it would have been probably mentioned by Tolkien in his writings. So,
Fair enough.
a dragon attacking the Shire is quite a significant event. But I mean, interestingly, I think in the early years of the Shire, you obviously got the whole battle between Arnor and Angmar is going on. So unless they're confusing it with something that came out of Angmar, it could be that. But as far as I'm aware, there's no actual truth to Bilbo's throwaway comment about a dragon in the Shire.
Fair enough. Richard Clammer follows that up by saying, so how old is the Shire? We've said about 1400 years. Where do the hobbits come from, and where do they go after the War of the Ring?
So like I said, this is told in Lord of the Rings. Hobbits originate in kind of like it's a little area of Middle Earth, sort of in between Fangorn Forest and Lothlorien. Mm-hmm. So they're kind of like they're a race of people that dwell on the banks of the river, and this is where Gollum comes from, because he's originally one of those hobbits. And so as the years go on, these hobbits essentially they make their way west over the mountains, and eventually they all settle in different regions of the Shire. So essentially, yes, it's a group of, we don't actually know where the first hobbit originates from. It's kind of it's another ambiguity in Tolkien's writings, but it's kind of like they start. He doesn't give like a specific origin date. It's just towards the middle of the Third Age they start to emerge in this small area, and then as the years go on, they move slowly westwards, settle in the Shire, and they do become part of the Kingdom of Arnor, but they're granted independence. I think it is following the fall of the North Kingdom and the defeat of Angmar. They essentially become an independent province. But moving on into hobbits in the Fourth Age, I am assuming they just continue to live in the Shire. There's a little bit of commentary that Sam's daughter Goldilocks, she and her family, sort of the Shire essentially is what little story is told about the Shire is the Shire slowly expands a little bit more towards the sea. Mm-hmm. And so there's kind of like there's a little area where some of Sam's descendants end up, and they kind of make that their own place to live. But according to Tolkien, that's where the famous Red Book of Westermarch ends up, which essentially is Bilbo's tale of the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. So essentially, yeah. So the hobbits continue to live in the Shire, and the little area they live in just basically gets a little bit bigger. So they kind of, and like the way Tolkien implies in Lord of the Rings, so they existed in like the Middle Ages of Middle Earth, and then by the time we've come along as people, the hobbits have tended to disappear. So they're kind of they're a little people who exist along the time of the Middle Earth, but like it says in his writings, don't underestimate the little people. So.
Richard also asks, dwarves and dragons have a long history. What specifics are their interactions? Is that quite a long question?
I wouldn't say it's overly long. It's essentially that initially the first dragons arrived essentially during the whole affairs of the Silmarillion, where elves and dwarves and men made war against the forces of Morgoth, is when dragons start to arrive in the story. But it's kind of like there's a big battle that goes on where the dragons start to arrive and start burning everything, and the dwarves, because I think of their heavy armor, they can actually resist the heat of the dragon. I'm not saying they're fireproof. I don't think he's meant to say they're fireproof. He's meant to say because of the leather. I think they're probably wear heavy mail over leather, so they can resist the fire. So they're the ones who they're not too afraid of the dragon. They fight. They're the ones who actually charge in and fight the dragons. And then obviously the year goes on. The dwarves start to amass great treasure hoards. Because so obviously dragons covet gold, and in the Iron Hills and areas in the far north where the dwarves initially settle, you get a lot of dragons who are dwelling in the mountains at that point. So it would make sense that the dwarves would probably clash with the dragons as they try to make their own home in the mountains. So they're busy making their home, and then a dragon comes along and starts burning things down. It's kind of like, the story is that I think Thorin's great-great-grandfather is killed by a dragon, and so is his great-grandfather. And so essentially his family then, they basically get driven out of the northern lands of Middle-earth by the dragons, and eventually end up settling at the Lonely Mountain and turn it into the Kingdom of Erebor. So there's a lot of animosity between dwarves and dragons, because essentially they've been fighting each other for since the first age of Middle-earth. So hopefully that's not too long-winded an explanation, but that's kind of, there's been animosity since dragons first arrived in Middle-earth.
There's a throwaway line in the extended Desolation of Smaug by Gandalf, who says that 4 dwarf rings are consumed by dragons. So
there is that.
What happens to the other 3?
We assume that they're taken by Sauron. So like 4 of the dwarven rings have been consumed by dragonfire, but Sauron, I think Sauron has possession of 3 of them. I think because what essentially happens is they try and bribe, because Sauron wants information on Bilbo and the ring, they try and bribe the dwarves of the Lonely Mountain with one of the lost dwarven rings. So that's essentially what's happened to the dwarf rings. The dragons have either been consumed them, or Sauron's got them.
Dane tells them to get stuffed, basically, doesn't he, when he comes asking about Bilbo?
Pretty much, yes.
Radio.
I can imagine trouble is, now that obviously we've had Dane played by Billy Connolly, we can probably guess how that exchange went.
Josh Triffitt would like to know, where did the Men of Dale descend from, and also the Wild Men of Dunland?
Men of Dale, it's probably likely they came from the survivors of the various tribes of men that lived in the First Age. And so it's likely that after the whole war, they ended up they move across the mountains to basically escape from it all, and they end up settling in the Far East. It's kind of, there's not a massive origin story for quite a lot of the races. It's the same for, essentially, the Dunlendings are kind of easier to explain, because they are the people that lived in Rohan before Gondor gave the land of Rohan to the riders of Eorl to basically live in. So the Dunlendings were like the indigenous people, and the Rohirrim essentially drove them. Well, Saruman says that the Dunlendings were driven out by the Rohirrim, and there is a bit of truth behind that story. So yeah, essentially, the Men of Dale don't have an enormous origin story, so you kind of have to be a bit inventive with those. But for the Dunlendings themselves, they used to dwell in Rohan and basically got driven out by the Rohirrim, probably because they took umbrage with new people moving into their lands. And so, but yeah, the Rohirrim were much better fighters, and obviously they drove out the Dunlendings, which created quite a bit of animosity, and Saruman builds on that to help basically recruit the Dunlendings to him.
So moving on from dwarves, we know that the gates of Minas Tirith are replaced by mithril gates. Why are dwarves the only people who saw this material and thought, we're going to mass mine this, mass manufacture it? Because surely every faction in Middle-earth would want that.
Probably because the dwarves were the only race that was gifted with mining, I think, because again we get into the realms of the Silmarillion. Essentially, the person who creates the dwarves was known as a craftsman, and so he kind of instills that ability in the dwarves themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because naturally the dwarves would be the only the dwarves are the only ones who kind of to dwell underground would obviously have mined this armor. So it's entirely possible that they would then sell it on to the various different races, saying, "Look, we've found this super tough, near impenetrable metal for a lot of money. You can have it and turn it into armor." So we know that the elves were very, very good smiths and craftsmen. They could take the mithril and they could turn it into armor and weaponry and that sort of thing. But the dwarves were The dwarves were the only ones who could mine it. I mean, orcs weren't really good at mining it. The elves didn't. The elves don't do mining. Their delicate fingers are probably not suited for grabbing a pickaxe. But yeah, so the dwarves are the only real mining race of Middle Earth. So it makes sense that they are the ones who stumbled upon the mithril, and so essentially, learning of its nature, they decided we can make weapons out of it, and we can then sell it to the other races, and they can turn it into weaponry, that sort of thing.
Peter asks, how did Smeagol live for so long without the ring, if it was the ring that was granting him the unnaturally long life?
Well, that is an unusual question, because it's the ring that grants Smeagol the long life. I mean, so hobbits have an unnaturally long life as it is. I mean, like, obviously Bilbo lives to 100 and, well, when he sails away west, he's 131 years old. So they have a prolonged existence naturally. So it could be that obviously it could be that the ring extended Gollum's natural lifespan. And it's 60 years obviously after losing the One Ring. He basically is when he gets involved with Frodo, Sam, and the quest of Mount Doom. So it could entirely be he's motivated through those 60 years purely for revenge, because it's essentially explained he leaves the cave to try and find Bilbo. So it is entirely possible that he is just driven by one desire for revenge on Bilbo, and two, just a sheer desire for the ring. It's kind of this is going to sound weird. An interesting way to compare it would be, this is going to sound really, really weird, Darth Maul in the Star Wars Clone Wars series.
Right.
Because it's like he gets, again, it's a little bit different, because he gets cut in half by Obi-Wan Kenobi. But he says that he survives because of his sheer hatred for Obi-Wan Kenobi. So it's kind of like the idea of hatred and revenge is what keeps a person going. So that could be why Gollum has such a prolonged lifespan after losing the ring. So that's one way of looking at it. It's a strange comparison, but it does make sense when you actually then think. So it's the whole revenge and hatred is a strong motivator to keep going.
So the film sort of says 500 years he sits there in the cave with the ring. Is that accurate?
Pretty much, yes.
Why doesn't the ring make Sauron invisible like the other ring wearers?
That one, I honestly don't know. One possible explanation, if it is an explanation at all, is that Sauron used to have a fair form. He could appear in a fair form to people. And after the downfall of Numenor, essentially his body was destroyed and his spirit fled back to Mordor, where he was essentially told that because of your treachery and corrupting this entire race and kingdom, you will not be allowed to assume a pleasing form anymore. Mm-hmm. So it could entirely be that he's cursed by the Valar to constantly have an unpleasant form, and like the invisibility you can't just hide and be invisible. People need to see your true self. So that's one way of looking at it, but I will admit that it is stretching the interpretation quite a bit. It could just be that it could just be that it was the power of the ring. It's not very well explained. So it's one of those it's open to interpretation.
Would have been much funnier just to have this invisible guys flying left, right, and centre. Just like, what is this coming from?
Yeah, no, it would have looked quite good. But yeah, I think there's loads of unanswered questions from the Lord of the Rings, and again, some of them can be explained just by reading it a bit, by reading things like the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales and other Tolkien. But some of it it's down to own interpretation.
I've read something about it's to do with the ring transports the soul into the world of the void, which Sauron already exists in, so he's not transported in the same way. But that's why the wraiths, which are basically invisible beings that wear cloaks. That's why they are connected to the ring, and that's why it makes mortal people disappear. It basically transports you between sort of planes.
Yeah, that sounds a better explanation than my one. But yeah, because again, it's not something I am familiar with, so it could be some you've picked up on something that's a little bit outside my knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Final question. Tom Maynard has chipped in with, so is Valinor basically heaven, or is it a lot more complicated than that?
The short answer, it's a lot more complicated. It was essentially after Middle-earth was created, they essentially decided, okay, so we've got elves, we've got men, we're going to have dwarves at some point. The elves are kind of like the firstborn, they're going to live forever, so let's create somewhere where they're going to want to live forever. So they created this land, and they tried to fill it with good things and with bad. They kind of tried to fill it with all sorts of things that they would like to have. So like fair places to dwell in. And they tried to encourage the elves to live there. And obviously certain elves did decide to live there, certain elves didn't decide to live there. And it's kind of, yeah, it's a lot more complicated than heaven, because there's kind of again, this is where you get into the realms of the Silmarillion. I think to explain it all would take far too long. And so the easiest answer to Tom's question is it's not heaven. It's a lot more complicated than that. It's meant to be a land that was created for the elves to live in, essentially whilst Middle-earth carried on with its normal affairs, and the elves could just live there in peace and forget about everything.
I think the link might have been made also that the description, Pippin in the film laments that he's about to die, and Gandalf gives him a description of what it was like for him when I don't know if he technically dies, but when he was transforming into Gandalf the White, and he describes about a curtain rolls back and all turns to silver glass, and that is actually lifted from the Return of the King book, which is what Frodo describes what he's seeing as his ship leaves the Grey Havens as he's going to Valinor. So potentially there is a mix-up there because they've used the exact same quote.
There is potentially a mix-up. It's kind of different. The idea is when an elf dies, his spirit doesn't actually go anywhere. It goes to essentially a waiting place in Valinor, and at some point, it's kind of like Glorfindel is one of those elves who dies and, well, supposedly dies and then comes back at a later date. We don't know if it's the same Glorfindel, it could be a different one, but the idea was elves don't exactly die, they go somewhere to wait till they return to their bodies, whereas things like men, dwarves, hobbits, they all die and their spirits go beyond the world. So it could be Gandalf is saying, this is what happened to me, but he doesn't actually know what would happen to Pippin if he died. It's Gandalf trying to give Pippin comfort before dying. I think so. This is kind of this is where you get into the whole philosophy, and there's a lot of debate about this on various Facebook groups. So there's kind of, if you look out there for things like, there's the Tolkien Society, that's probably the biggest one out there in the Facebook world. So, but yeah, there's all sorts of groups that will have these debates about the afterlife in the concept of Middle Earth. So like I said, there's the simplest answer is it's not heaven. So it's a bit more complicated than that. But I can see where you hear something in a film, and again, because the films adapt the book and they take certain things from the book and put them in, it distorts the meaning slightly, and that's kind of, I think that's where quite a bit of sort of book film confusion stems from. But like I said, the films are still very well made. But yeah, again, we can probably have a debate a later day about the differences between completely 100% true to the books and them just being adapting the film to make it a bit less complicated.
Sure. I went to heaven. You, on the other hand, Pippin, have been stealing mushrooms from Farmer Maggot all your life.
Yeah, exactly. You're in trouble.
I'm not sure what the whole YouTube spiel is that Josh usually does, so to be honest, I'm just going to go with, Thank you very much for listening. This has been a bit of a indulgence passion project for me, where I've got to talk to somebody who knows an awful lot about the law, but we've tried to keep it a little bit relevant by talking about the profiles in the game and the models that we might get in the future. So look, if you have enjoyed listening to the wisdom of James Wilson, then let us know in the comments below, and we can look at doing another one in the future. Till then, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.